This is Modern Gaming Culture. This series will attempt to highlight the phenomenon of PC, console, and mobile gaming and bring to light all of its phenomenal aspects. Let's take a dive together into the world of modern gaming and take apart its structure. Now, here's your host, Rotimi Osagi. All right, this is Modern Gaming Culture. This is episode 26, Modern Gaming Culture. Continuing with unpacking what I consider the times we be living in, uh, which I refer to as Internet Dark Age, and the sort of emergence of what I call, the Internet bully. So there's a lot to unpack, so it's going to take as long as it takes. Um, but I still want to keep people up to speed with what's in the pipeline. So I'm going to start with some housekeeping. So done quite a few series. Set this up here. About stuff like VGC deck profiles, TCG deck profiles. There's just footage from Hyper Burning, I believe I was doing. Might be a Terra Burning. Actually, it is a Terra Burning. It's from Maple Story. Um, and something I want to continue doing. Right, I feel like it's very valuable material. Right, um, and so I want to keep people up to date with that. Um, and you know, give them a heads up regarding stuff like that. You know, I've teased deck profile series already, um, and sort of explained. Which I'm not going to do again here. About why I'm not going to be moving forward with that yet. Right. Um, but with a lot of these things, there's just a lot of confusion. Right. And that's ultimately, what drives my, desire to want to, take these projects on, right? People sort of feel like a lot of these things are very, free form, right? And nothing could be further from the truth, right? You know, um, Again, right? I often say that the most dangerous thing that you could do to somebody is shelter them from the world, right? And so what you find with a lot of people is you find a lot of you know characteristics of what's being called in a lot of different schools of thought, right? But um, and you find this sort of, anomaly, right? And, you know, people often hinge upon, this as, indication of some, you know, great, whatever that's coming, right? Um, and, again, right, this is not something that particularly affects, you know, um, the average citizen, right? More than it does affect, people like me, right? Um, who, you know, are, um, you know, very impactful, right? And so it's not something where you can sort of gauge anything based on, um, something like this, right? So, moving forward, I want that to be something that is just very, clear and out there, right, for your consideration, right? This show, again, right, talk about how I want to do, multiple episodes in one sitting, right? Sort of just edit them and then, put them out, right? Sort of like how the spirit of Internet Radio was sort of headed to, right? For, internet censorship wave, as I call it, occurred, right? And this is still something I want to do as well, right? Um, it's just, um, these things take resources, right? And so it's not something where, um, it's just, going to emerge and somehow, you know, this is going to look like, InfoWars or something like that, right? And so the material is what's important ultimately, right? And so even if I have to do this, audio only, right? So be it, right? Text is just not a very effective way of communicating a message, right? Um, and so, a lot of context gets lost, right? When you use, text, right? To sort of try to convey something, right? And so, you know, that's where we're at, right? So, um, you know, if you want to support, you know, first of all, you should watch from the very beginning, right? Um, and really try to listen to what I'm saying, right? Um, you know, don't take this as some sort of intellectual curiosity, which is a very common theme with people who like to participate in the gaming arena, right? You know, and really try to gauge what I'm saying, not from just you know um your reaction to it, right? Try to gauge it from really a more broader perspective, right? Um, so just gonna leave that there, right? And to continue, um, last episode was definitely I would even consider even for myself was definitely very confusing, right? But again, with a lot of this material, especially when it comes to the gaming arena, right? You really cannot um, portray your message in a very foreboding way, so to speak, right? You really have to keep your wits about you, right? And so even when it comes to something like this, when I'm really trying to convey a message, right? I still have to keep my wits about me, and so as a result, right, it's going to come off confusing, right? And so even for me, for the last episode, really listening back, I know that's probably the most confusing um, material I've published on the internet, right? Um, because you know I would categorize that as something I would put into an outtake. It's not even something that I would even um, sort of just to sort of provide a little context about last episode before I continue with unpacking what I consider the time we'd be living in, to which is in a dark age, right? Um, you know, it's yeah, that's something where again, right, when I was really preparing for the show, right? Um, again, right, I would really try to gauge, right, my progress based on, you know, how palatable the material was, right? And so, as I started to find that the material became more palatable, right? And I could really outline, sort of the direction I want to take with the show, right? In terms of the material, right? That's when I decided to pull the trigger and, publish episode one, right? And then go from there, right? And so, when with an episode like that, right? Um, you know, it's not even an episode that I would even particularly even consider palatable enough to, even publish, right? And so this is an episode where, definitely gonna live in my head rent free for sure. Because honestly, I'm not too proud of it. But either way, right? I feel like it's a really good way of really diving more into what I've been saying, right? So that you understand that this is not just something you can take at face value, right? Even for me, right? When I'm even trying to, really put together a tapestry, right? Like I've been doing for the last few episodes, right? We're really trying to unpack this dynamic, right? You know, it's even something where I'm just like, you know, like, um, did I do that well? Did that come off well? Right? Was that well delivered? Right? So, even for me, right? Don't, just hinge on every single word I say, right? Again, we're dealing with a lot of people who are very impressionable, right? When I'm just talking about just gamer culture in general, right? People are very impressionable. And so it's like, again, right? We understand that, there's nothing new under the sun, right? But at the same time, right? Still want to, um, you know, for the people, who I'm trying to reach, right? You know, really provide that, light hand, right? Lighthearted, delivery, right? Um, and really provide like companionship, right? So, you know, when it really comes to investigating, what I call, the times we living in, you know, I've been using this description to sort of highlight what I've been talking about, right? And this is not the beyond end all of what I'm talking about, right? Again, this is something where you really need to, because a lot of material out there, um, which would fall under, very, which would fall under the category of what I would categorize as educational outreach, right? They really try to convey it in a very beginner to intermediate, right, um casual even context, right, so as not to scare people away. But I would consider this show, right, and considering what's in the pipeline, etc., right, I would consider this show to be definitely a lot more intermediate to um advanced, right, or if you want to use gaming terms, right, casual competitive to like competitive, right, material, right? And so it's not material that I would particularly even recommend, right? So when it comes to really analytics, right? When it comes to really investigating, um, analytics, right? Time viewed, right? Traffic across all platforms, right? Promotion, right? Um, you know, even getting through a lot of these checks, right? Like episode 7, for example, um, uh, etc. Right? I understand that, you know, this is not material that I even expect people to latch onto, right? Because again, when it comes to gaming culture, people really think that somehow you've got it, right? Because, a lot of gaming culture comes from, what's generally referred to colloquially as gaming, right? Which is gambling. And so these two sort of worlds very much intertwined. And so as a result, advancements in gaming culture sort of try to borrow from success in gaming, right, or gambling, right. And so as a result, you know, when it comes to really putting something out there, when it comes to gaming, people really expect it to be like gambling, and obviously nothing could be further from the truth, right. And so I just want to make that sort of qualification moving forward, right. Again, what you have in gaming culture is, anybody with two brain cells to rub together. I call gaming culture, the most abject tyranny on planet Earth, right? What you have in gaming culture is people who've just dedicated themselves to evil. Quite frankly, there's really no other way to really describe it, right? You know, um, these people, are completely dedicated to just doing as much damage as they possibly can. And, Ex- and generally the way people are punished in society, right, is through the judiciary system, and so simultaneously they're also trying to avoid jail time simultaneously, right. So when you have all of these big streamers who've been doing all these very crazy wild things, right, over the last 10 years, right, using games like League of Legends particularly, right, now realizing basically they just dedicate themselves to evil, right. um, you know, it's entering that arena where entering that realm where now these people are facing the consequences of their actions, right? And so, you know, people, children, right, who are very impressionable, right, and with impressionability also comes wisdom, right, and so, well, obviously not, empirical wisdom, right, not to get into categories of wisdom, but we're talking about people who are just, smart, basically, right? Sharp, right? And so they're very quick to avoid danger, ultimately, right? So it's not necessarily wise or impressionable, it's just very quick to avoid danger, right? Talking about gaming here. And so, that's ultimately where you get these odds where basically players who are just leaps and bounds better than most players are not able to, eke out wins as they should, right? I'm talking about the people who I'm trying to reach here, right? And so, you know, um, it's something where now because they're starting to face their consequences, of their actions and stuff like that, you're getting this sort of lull, right? On places like Twitch, for example, Reddit, right, where these would be, um, sort of zones for discovery. Right now, they're just basically becoming shit shows, which is what they were in the whole place. But basically having this bubble, right, to sort of exploit, they were able to really draw people into their folds, right? And now basically just not having that capacity anymore, right? And so um, it's something where you can't necessarily just again, this is something where you can really source a lot of stuff, right? Can't necessarily, hinge upon every word I'm saying, right? I mean, I think again, if you've been listening, right, you realize, um, you can't do that, right? And so, I recommend, people really, again, right? I've been really trying to emphasize these points, right? What I call conducting internet oversight, right? And so it's not something where you can just particularly, right? And it's not even the way I fashioned it, right? This is just common sense, right? If you've been listening, right, you know, you should realize by now, you're not going to be able to show up here and then just get everything you need to know, right? I'm really trying to help people get pointed in the right direction. And again, I'm trying to talk about the people. I'm trying to reach the people I'm trying to reach here, right? And so honestly, I could not, give a damn if you don't like the way I deliver. If you don't like my delivery, you know, it's your funeral, right? So, again, right? Um, something, I can share about, um, times before, the internet censorship wave occurred, right? Is that, you know, um, there was very, um, it wasn't something where you were very much, um, drawn in to, um, personality, right? It was something where you could very much understand that, people were really trying to, um, you know, um, run interference, so to speak, right? Um, and so, and there was also just this very much narrative of, you know, um, we have all the material, you know, that, people who really try to preserve, you know, knowledge, right, at our fingertips, right? And, again, it's just being squandered, right? Um, and so, yeah, you're not going to find that anywhere because, again, those are the people who are doing it, and they just completely just got wiped off the internet, and their material was not backed up, and so it's just gone forever, right? And so this is something where I really emphasize, listen to what I'm saying, right? You know, um, you have to really get out there and really, dig for material, right? Because it's out there for sure, right? So I'm just gonna leave it there for the former part of this episode. Um, and to conclude, again, I really just want to further emphasize this, really listen to what I'm saying, right? This is not just some show where you can just come on here and you're just going to get everything you need, right? And you're just going to be on your way, right? You have to really listen to what I'm saying and really dig in, right? So, this is Modern Gamer Culture. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you.